Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another podcast of the Sensory Approach to Manual Therapy. My guest today is Amanda Rocheleau, who I have known 25-ish years now,
I'd say so.
since we were teenagers. And I'm excited to talk about her because the last couple of podcasts we've done have really focused on what we in the profession experience with burnout, some of the science, things like that, and some of the results of burnout. And one has been from an athlete on what they do to help cope with it, and another professional. But this time we're going to speak with someone who teaches classes on how to help people deal with burnout, especially in the healthcare industry, which is really important. So I'm going to let Amanda introduce herself here and say hi.
Hey, thank you for that was actually a pretty good introduction right there. That is what I do, and that is who I am. My name is Amanda, and I'm a registered social worker in Ontario, actually. So I am on the border, still a Quebecer, living in Gatineau, but my practice is in Ontario. Yeah, so as a life of a social worker, I spent a lot of time with folks who are dealing with pretty severe mental health issues and addiction issues and trauma issues. And it took about 10 years into my career for me to realize how important the topic of burnout was to me personally and to my profession.
Now,
And
that's because
so
you experienced it, correct?
because I experienced a massive burnout in my 20s, and which I'm open book about, love talking about it actually, because I tell my story. But that being said, I've heard my story through others like 1,000 times over now. But that was a turning point in my career, and so nowadays, I really am passionate about talking about burnout and other related psychological issues like compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, really relevant to any sort of I call us all helpers. Like it's like the collective term that sort of brings us all together. We help in different ways, and we have different backgrounds and different professions, but different job titles. But the thing we all have in common is that we're out there just trying to help people. And there's a tax into that experience. And so these days I do workshops, as you said. I teach about how to protect ourselves and how to prevent burnout, but also how to recover from it. I talk about workplace wellness and personal wellness and what I like calling mindful self-care. I love breaking the rules about self-care and try to define it differently than just kind of the pampering ourselves kind of aspect. And
Oh,
then
I'm
and then
really excited to dig into that.
Right, like, yeah, we got
Yeah.
a lot to talk about. So yeah, so that's a little bit of what I do, and what I've experienced so far, and I would love to have this conversation with you about all of that.
Fantastic. And about a year ago, Amanda actually had me as a guest on her
Mhm.
podcast, The Giving Tree.
Yeah.
And it was a similar subject, only I approached it more from a physiological aspect of what's happening to the brain through memory and habit and habituation.
Hmm.
And today I want to have her approach to it, which is going to be focusing a lot on the self-care aspect, because I think that's something that a lot of manual therapists are taught body mechanics. They're taught how to try to maintain a grounded presence during treatment so they don't walk away with transference issues and things like that. But, most manual therapists are not business professionals. They're not taught how to run a very successful business. And yet most of us are self-employed. It's still the largest category. And so the stresses of running a business, let alone client retention, all these things like
Yeah.
that, come into, like you said, there's a tax
Yeah.
on being a healthcare provider. And those taxes are often not accounted for. And so I'm excited to talk about that. Now, with that in mind, do you want to start with maybe your personal experience around your burnout and your story? Because I'm sure some listeners, like I know myself, because I know your story, but I'm sure some of my listeners will also sit there and relate and be like, "Oh, that's something that I fully understand and relate to," and to see now that you've come out of it, shining
Mhm.
really and stronger for it, will hopefully give them an understanding of hope as well.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that you word it that way because I often say to myself on a regular basis, when I'm kind of doing some gratitude practices, I often mentally say to myself that I am grateful for my burnout because it was a massive pivotal moment in my life and makes me who I am today. So I don't regret it. I don't try to hide it. I am grateful for it. So I don't know where do I even start with that story? I
You
mean,
started with addiction mainly, correct?
yeah, I was working in the shelter systems in Ottawa, and working, in very psychologically demanding jobs. I mean, providing, psychotherapy, or counseling, providing crisis interventions. It was intense work. At the time, I had normalized it a lot, though. When you're doing that work, it just becomes your world. And a lot of people kind of say directly or indirectly, kind of like, well, this is what you signed up for. So yeah, it's it's this, it's tough.
Which is a
But you're not
really
supposed to
interesting way of
acknowledge that it's tough.
yeah, it's a really interesting way of deflecting the importance, seriousness, and severity
Yep.
of the impact that type of work has. It
The
just
impact.
kind of
Like
says if you
nobody
don't
talks
have
about
it,
the impact.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So, I mean, looking back, it's like, it's so funny having left that kind of crisis work. Looking back, I was like, oh my God, that was really wild stuff. So it was, so needless to say, there were a lot of stressors. There was just a lot that I was exposed to, things I had to do, things I had to see, decisions I had to make that were, frankly, very troubling, very stressful. And so there was that, like the mental load and the emotional burden of going through those struggles. But another big part of the burnout story was just also, frankly, my personality and my core beliefs of what I was going into, adulthood, a career, and becoming a parent. All of those beliefs were pretty much set me up to fail. They pretty much set me up to burnout
I
because
love
I
that.
thought I
It's
was
one of the rare times I'll hear.
invincible.
It's one of the rare times I'll hear someone say, "My beliefs set me up for failure, not
Yeah.
success."
And it's so funny because you can look at them from these different angles and you think like, well, those are some pretty cool ideas. Like, this like mission in life to be the best person that you can be, and to be, this generous, giving, helpful person. Of course, those are a lot of my core values, and they led me, were factors in a lot of my decision making. But I kind of joke about it, but I sort of raise my hand and kind of go like, I'm an overachiever, people pleaser in recovery. Like I'm, I am. That was me, right? And so being an overachiever people pleaser meant that I did prioritize the needs of others over my own pretty much all the time. And I had no sense of personal boundaries. I had no idea that I had limits. I thought I was a superhero who was just like, go, 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 and could live
The
off coffee
overachiever
and
people pleaser. My God, I'm going to remember that one because you just perfectly summarize like most people who believe in anything that you would say is like slightly for the betterment of the world, which is
Mhm,
self-embetterment, mindfulness, all that
mhm,
kind of stuff.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah, you kind of just
Yeah, yeah,
very well defined what happens if they don't have limits
yeah.
on their ability to care for other humans and not put themselves into the realm of
Into
people
the
who need
equation.
care.
Yeah. Even my quest for self-development, the how much time and energy I would spend in, just trying to grow as a human being and like expand my mind and be aware of what is going on in the world. That quest for self-development became this relentless cycle of self-improvement that led to me believing that I was never good enough as I was.
Never good enough, and that you can always do better,
You
even
could
when
always,
you have an empty gas tank.
yep,
You can
right.
always give more. You can always give another dollar. You can
Mm.
always give a little more of your energy. You can always be friendlier or give an ear to someone, even when you're the one who needs it.
You bet. That's
Yeah.
exactly it. And so,
Self
so,
improvement's
so
a
there are
bitch.
definitely, what's that?
Self improvement's a bitch, is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. I later in life learned a term. It's a Buddhist psychology term, and it's called the near enemy. And so we often think about things in opposites. We think, oh, there's self-improvement over here, and then there's, I don't know, laziness or something like that over here. But the near enemy is always like, it's like when you take a good thing and you just go a little too far with it and you cross that line. And that language, that term resonated a lot with me. And then I was like, I do a lot of really good stuff. I've got a lot of really great, aspects of my personality and like drivers and qualities and strengths. And then I just seem to always just push it a little too far into that near enemy,
Well, I think I love that term too, but you're also describing to me something that happens so much in the self-employment world, which again is most manual therapists, which I know at the time you were working a lot for yourself. And it's this thing of separating the self from their business identity, meaning, with your friends and your family, when you're a giver, you're going to want to give no matter what. When someone who personally is in need, you're going to give everything you can to help them out.
Yep.
And then when it comes to business, because that's a personality trait, it's a difficult thing to put limits on and to say, I need to step away. I need to have boundaries. I need to limit my availabilities. I need to turn my phone off. I need to not answer those messages. Simply because it's in our nature to want to do that. And then we wrap up our business with our identity. So it's like, if I don't do it, then I will not only be changing my identity, but I'll be losing my business at the same time.
There's always
those limits. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, when you work for yourself, there's nobody really who's, helping you be accountable to those limitations. And there's no parameters around the job. I mean, any other, you go into a job that, that they give you a job description. They say, well, you're going to work 40 hours a week and you're going to take your lunches and this is what you do and this is what you don't do. And, even in Ontario now they have laws that are about, like a not being communicated with after work. I've completely
in France they have like that on Sundays.
The right to disconnect, the right to disconnect, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like again, when we're sort of employed there, it's a little easier to figure out where those boundaries are. When you're self-employed, you have to make up the rules yourself. And we do put a lot of pressure on ourselves. And that's, I think, the part of the burnout story that I like talking about the most is sort of the psychological part of it, the untold story that's happening in your own head and with your own fears and with your own traits and characteristics, because we all have stressors. Like, without a doubt, you can just create this formula that says, like, if you have enough overwhelming amount of stressors that cause overwhelming amount of stress or chronic stress, like that's what burnout is, essentially a chronic stress syndrome. It's you will absolutely experience burnout symptoms if you're dealing with chronic stress, and chronic stress typically comes from chronic stressors. So that's like most of our lives. We all have chronic stressors.
That's a fantastic way of saying it, because in all the other podcasts I mentioned it, and I'll mention it here again. I don't know if I remember. I don't think I knew it at the time when I did your podcast, which was allostatic load. And allostatic load is defined as the ability to withstand daily cumulative stress. That's it. And allostatic overload is when we're overwhelmed. So It's like you said, chronic stressors. Some are momentary, traffic accident in front of you. Some are lifelong, your job, things like that.
Yeah.
And so you're just describing this amazing term that we have, allostatic load, which when it becomes chronically overwhelmed, creates this background stress that's hard for us to manage over long term. So what are some of the symptoms that you find typically are appearing, not only for yourself, but also for the people who you work with a lot of the time, where you're saying, okay, your chronic stressors are, like, here are some warning signs that you should start paying attention?
Yeah. Well, the research I've done around burnout do typically give you sort of these 3 general chapters of the experience. And then in those chapters, there's some symptomology. So chapter 1 is exhaustion, right? Energy depletion. So that is one that most of us can relate to. And that is, if you start noticing that chronic exhaustion, right? That the way I always say it is, like, when you start borrowing energy from tomorrow to get through today, and then you start your day tomorrow with, like, in debt, in energy debt, right? And that, if that happens long enough, then that's not only very, like that causes a whole other sort of stress on the body, right? Because your nervous system knows that it is not regulated and that it is trying to do more than it can replenish, kind of like trying to drive the car on an empty gas tank, right? But the next chapter of that is really interesting because it is an attitude shift that happens. It's the mental distancing. It's the cynicism and the negativity that starts to seep into your psychological experience and how you approach the world and how you live your life and how you are in your relationships, or how you see your job or your business, right? And it's just like that negativity seeps in, and it's like you put on that lens and you can't, it's not just a matter of relaxing the body or replenishing the energy at that point. It's you cannot no longer relax the stress of how you see the world. So that mental distancing, I think, is essentially like a psychological coping mechanism, because you're like, wow, everything's so overwhelming. So if I care less, or if I'm less mentally engaged as I go through the motions, then maybe that's just the only way that I can replenish or like hold some energy, left.
That really makes me reevaluate. That really makes me reevaluate dark senses of humor, because I'm a big fan of cynicism.
Yeah.
And it just it just makes it really interesting all of a sudden, where you're like, oh, I wonder. Now there's probably an equilibrium somewhere where cynicism is not related to burnout, right? But it would just be interesting to look back. Like I look back at some of the people I've worked with when I was on the cycling circuit, and I look back on some of the people I've worked with in the sports industry, and I go, oh, they were cynical humans and they were burnt out. I can like literally go through the names in my head. And I'm like, that person was in a bad mood, cynical. That person was in a funny mood, cynical. Exactly. And you can tell when they were like, oh, you should have left the industry, changed teams, you should have changed jobs, or taken a break, because it was obvious now that I look back at it.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at the nuances for sure. And like what I think I hear you saying is that there is this kind of intuition that sort of says like where there is a line, even though it's really hard to articulate that. Because that's actually one of my warning signs that I sort of track for myself is my humor. So just in general, like if I just my husband just said this morning, like, you've been really playful for like 3 weeks. And I mean, like, yeah, like that's like really an indicator of like where I'm at in terms of that balance, right? And how far from burnout I am. And so the playfulness disappears, the creativity disappears, the humor doesn't disappear, but it gets like I'm pretty sharp. I think my humor is like also,
and still a Monty Python fan.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the dark humor, and I know who I can joke with that way. But some, one of those like little red alerts is when something comes out of my mouth and like either my partner or a friend will be like, "Ooh, like too far, too
or it doesn't get the laugh you thought it was going to
get. It doesn't, and it just makes their jaw drop. Then you're like, yeah, that's not just my regular old, kind of dark humor. That's
a passive aggressive version of saying I'm not happy.
Coming out there, trying to be expressed. So that's phase 2 and it's kind of subtle. And again, we can break it down to other symptoms, but the humor is a perfect, little sliver of it. Phase 3 of the burnout experience is the feelings of inefficacy or like lack of confidence. So the way I always say it is sort of like that, like cynicism gets turned inward.
And you're not valuable enough.
There's like, yeah, it's like self-judgment, and you're questioning everything, imposter syndrome, self-doubt. And in reality, you actually, by the time you get there, you actually have been probably making a lot of mistakes, because the chronic stress is piling up and it is
affecting your decision-making process and everything.
100%. So then you start personalizing all that instead of seeing it as symptoms of burnout. Like naturally I would be messing up a lot, or not building great connections with my clients or something. Because of all this chronic stress. No. Then instead you go, I'm a I was gonna F up, you don't have
this podcast has vulgarity on it. It's okay.
Okay, we're good. You're right. But yeah, it's all that personalization now of the whole burnout experience. And it's amazing how when I'm talking to burnout, how personal they take it and feel. And I love doing that work with people in therapy to help them understand the whole thing as an equation. And I call it like the ecosystem. Like you're in this environment, this ecosystem. And frankly, we could probably go on a big rant just about how, like, in general, society kind of sets us all up for burnout, right?
Well,
This
I was gonna go
lifestyle that we're
back
all
to
trying to live.
yeah, I was gonna go back to point number one because to me that one it's interesting because I can see exhaustion being a stage where people are self-aware. Oh, I'm tired. I
Yeah,
feel exhausted and it's been long
100%.
term. Stage number two, I can see beginning in the process of like, oh man, that was dark. That wasn't dark. That was passive. It wasn't passive. So you're kind of conscious of your behavior, but kind of unconscious. And the last one, I can see people being completely unaware of that level where they're so burnt out that they're disconnected from themselves and they don't realize that that lack in self-confidence, that imposter syndrome is coming from behavior that they've set up. And it's so internalized that it's unconscious.
You
And
bet.
so it's interesting because with the
100% agree.
exhaustion level, I mean, I could probably go outside and talk to, 50 of my neighbors and 49 of them will tell me they're exhausted.
Yep. Yep.
And so how do people begin determining or understanding this level of exhaustion is a positive? Because like, for example, I can be exhausted because I worked out or I did a big construction project or I've been teaching a lot of classes or had a big caseload, or I can be exhausted because I'm like depleting the tank because you're not sleeping enough, kids are sick, or you're just exhausted in general. How do you start distinguishing between, okay, this exhaustion that you're feeling, this fatigue that you're feeling is a positive,
Mm-hmm.
or it's just something you'll recover from, or now it's getting chronic?
Yeah. 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 Uh, so I want to say two things. So I want to answer that question, but I also want to back up to that unconscious experience that we were just referring to, because I don't think we talk enough about that. And I there isn't necessarily anything to back this up, but as a I would say a professional and an expert in the field, basically I call that first phase burnout. Everything after that is numb out.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. So, and that's just the way I think about it and the way I see it, story after story after story. I think you are 100% right that burnout is it's just a way of, for me, just to I don't know, it's just a way of classifying it. But like I see that pattern of like, yeah, there's the burning the fuel and just like having to gas up, burn the fuel and gas out kind of thing. And then after that, I think a lot of the coping mechanisms that I see are like related to avoidance, and without going like too far into psychotherapy terms and stuff, but like that is one of our go-to, right? Like fight or flight and or freeze are our stress responses, and how that shows up in our lives today is like numbing out on the phone, procrastination,
Sleep deprivation through
decision
procrastination
paralysis.
thing.
Exactly, right? So yeah, so I really like that point, and that is why that a lot of people in really, really like in the later stages of burnout is almost like comes out of nowhere to them. They're like, whoa, I didn't know this was going to happen to me. It's because, yeah, we're just coping. So
That
um
avoidance, do you feel like that's I mean, sure, it might be a protective mechanism, but is it also perhaps just a mechanism of almost like a fear of admitting that there's a weakness within ourselves, which as a society, especially in the West, people have a really hard time saying, I effed up, I made a mistake, this isn't right. And
yeah.
so here to say, oh, I need to take a break, I'm not strong enough to handle this, which is obviously something a lot of people have a hard time saying.
Yep.
Um, is that avoidance more from an aspect of cultural education, or is it more just something internally that as humans we like, no, we try to avoid change?
Well, all of the above. I mean, I think that is one of those resiliency factors that can either make people a little bit more susceptible to burnout or protect people from burnout, is their openness to vulnerability, their ability to ask for help. Even their perception of stress is one of the things that has been, researched about the stress experience, is that if you kind of like what you were talking about before about sort of the, I could be exhausted from the workout, um, and you accept that experience because there is this belief that I need to sort of stress my body in order for it to grow. And stress is not a bad thing. Stress is just, and we talked about this on the podcast, on my podcast, right? Was like, instead of like demonizing this idea of stress being this negative experience, that people who see stress and have these core beliefs where we go, well, this is actually okay, this is life, and view it that way, actually experience less long-term chronic stress as a result, right? It's a resiliency
Mm-hmm.
factor. So yeah, I think that some of the earlier warning signs, like how do we know this exhaustion that we're experiencing because we're just living these full, demanding, excuse me, busy day-to-day lives? How do we know like when it's a problem and we're crossing the line from just regular exhaustion to, an issue that can lead to burnout? The questions that I always ask is, well, how do you refuel? How do you recharge? How do you take care of yourself? And I know when people are like, I don't know what that means.
Yeah,
Like,
I don't
what are
ever
you
do it. I
talking
never take
about?
time for myself. It's always family first and job second,
Yeah,
or vice
yeah,
versa.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Then I know you're not just living a busy life where at the end of the day you're like, you're spent. I know now you're in debt because
Yeah.
you are not consciously refueling. You're not
So
consciously recovering.
how do you encourage people? Because for me, the word resilience is so vital. It's so important and so relevant, because there is this aspect to, being a human where resilience is necessary. And without it, we have, and people are resilient in some things. Like I'm resilient in some aspects, but when it comes to speaking French, like learning the language perfectly, I've been speaking it for 43 years. I still don't speak it perfectly. I make mistakes all the time. And trying to learn it hurts my brain. My ability to withstand the stress of learning a new language is very
Mm-hmm.
difficult. Whereas learning a new mathematical equation is, my brain loves that kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
or problem solving behaviors. And so that ability to handle resilience, um, like I'm trying to remember his name. He was at the American Massage Therapy Association National Convention. He does something called the grit score. Um, I can't remember his name, but anyways, he did something called the grit score, and the goal was to find out where you fit on the resilience scale, essentially, and tools you can use to help it grow. But is that something you try to encourage people to do? Is like work on aspects of the resilience?
Well, it's interesting. I think that that can definitely be a question that I ask, where it's sort of I'm looking for strengths, and interestingly enough, I think that what a lot of the helpers who are, frontline workers doing kind of human service work, veterinary work, that kind of stuff, a lot of them will actually say, oh yeah, I'm a super resilient person because we actually deal with a lot of crises and stuff like that. And yeah, and I do that every day, and I'm haven't gone nuts yet. I maintain some sanity. So and I actually can really relate to that, in that during the most crisis type situations, I'm probably one of the people in the room that's going to have the most what we call equanimity, right? Like
Yeah.
that psychological stability in the presence of chaos. Um and yet then again I go, oh, okay, cool, so great strength. I mean, it's super important to and we can call that resiliency, in the sense of, like, again, our ability to adapt and recover from a stressful experience. But when you like, so those are like kind of like acute situations. But then when you span out to sort of, as you were talking about, that everyday stress, um that's usually when they kind of go, and again, we really cue them and go, so what do you do to recover in those moments? They're having a hard time naming it. Sometimes people are doing things, but they don't realize that those are actually recovery modes.
Mhm.
Or people are doing things and it kind of works in the short term, but probably not, like, for example, avoidance by numbing on our phones, right? So
Or
when
eating something sweet. It's immediate
exactly.
gratification with long-term consequences.
Exactly. That's the work that I really like doing, of getting people to become intentional, self-aware, and doing things that actually are sort of filling up the cup from the bottom up, right? It's just not just like enough to get through those moments. So
I think you're describing something for me that I really like, which is like most humans would say that in a crisis they're good. Whether they
yeah,
are or not is a completely different
well,
subject. But
not most humans actually.
well, I
Like
don't know. I feel
honestly,
like
there's a
most people
lot
would
of
say,
people who
"Oh, when
like
my kids freak
lose
out,
it.
I'm totally able to handle it," or
Yeah,
like
yeah. Maybe
not
you're people,
everybody.
and maybe it's something that is a very common experience amongst helpers, and so you're talking to other helpers who are like that.
Yeah,
Like the reality is, there's a lot of people who react really badly in crises.
in crisis, yeah. So the question there for resilience though would be not in the crisis moment, because where I'm seeing, like with a lot of my clients right now who are burnt out, which I seem to, because I just went through a burnout last year, I seem to be seeing a significant number of clients, obviously, because that's part of my practice now.
Mhm.
And I'm seeing that it's not in the moment of crisis that they're failing. Like in the healthcare industry, all the nurses in Quebec, like most of the world right now, are all overworked and things like that. And so they're not failing when they're at their job. It's they go home, they don't have the energy to eat. Like I have two nurses right now who I see who say they go home, they're so tired at the end of the shift that they go home, they fall asleep, they don't have time to eat food.
Yeah.
So they're not handling the resilience outside of the crisis. And so with allostatic load, one of the things that I talk about in my courses and my classes is not filling the cup up from the bottom necessarily. But if we look at our life like this vase and you fill it with information, eventually when we numb out, which I love that term, we check out, we do all these coping mechanisms that are designed to reduce chronic stresses. What happens with long-term exposure to that is that we end up taking this large vase and making it small because we adapt to the stresses. We adapt to the container. The container adapts to the level of stress around within it.
Yeah.
And so what happens though is that when that container gets smaller over time, we are then less able and less resilient to handle stressors that are different. And so how do we take that container and instead of filling it up from the bottom or emptying it out from the top, which however, instead of reducing the level of chronic stress, instead it's how do we take that container and say, let's make the container bigger. Let's teach mechanisms where you're going to be able to handle just the same level of stress and more with a positive outcome. And that's one of the things that really interests me with a lot of the work that you do, because to me, when I listen to your podcast, that's all I'm hearing from people is that they're not necessarily in a place where they can reduce the stresses. They're not getting rid of their family. They're not changing their jobs.
Yep.
Their stress levels are at a minimum and / maximum at the exact same time.
Yep.
And so it's a fine balance. So how do we take their experience and say, okay, well, instead of keeping you within this tiny container, let's make your life, let's make it so where you can handle more. And I like the mindfulness aspect.
Yeah. I think that's probably my go-to, mindfulness work, self-awareness work. Sometimes I say self-awareness because mindfulness freaks people out. They're like, oh God, is she going to make me meditate? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to make you meditate. I'm going to make you pay attention to your life.
I call it kinesthetic awareness.
There you go. Right.
Be
We all
aware
have
of your
these like
body.
workarounds like that.
Be aware of your body in space and time.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, yeah, certain words kind of trigger us. And again, it's that comfort level of being vulnerable, because one of the reasons why I say so many of us are not self-aware or are afraid to do that self-awareness work is because we're afraid that when we actually look in and say, how am I really doing? Or what's really going on with me? How am I really feeling? What is my body telling me? We approach that experience with judgment, with analysis and measurements and comparison, and obviously it's a very unpleasant experience, so then we avoid doing it. We just stay focused on everybody else and what's going on in the outside world, and we stop paying attention to the inside world. So the combo is doing the self-awareness work, paying attention, and doing it with compassion, self-compassion. And if on a personal psychological kind of healing process, those are the components that every person needs in order to heal from burnout or protect themselves from burnout. we,
Can you
my
repeat those?
definition,
Because I find they're really important.
yeah. So self-awareness and self-compassion. It's the building blocks. So
The
the way I
self-compassion is
define,
one, yeah. The self-compassion is one that I tell my clients all the time, because like they'll come in and I'll talk about posture and then they'll instantly change how they sit. And my response is, I don't care about your posture. There are millions of humans who have horrible posture who are pain-free. So
yeah.
have whatever posture you want. I don't care about it. I do not believe that posture equals pain. I believe posture is a consequence of pain. And most therapists would
Mm.
actually say it's posture is the reason for your pain. And so I tell them instantly, your judgment on your own self is likely adding one, chronic stress, and it's also making it difficult for your willingness to change, because you're getting stuck in this loop of guilt around your own behavior makes you less likely to change your behavior out of fear of failure.
Yeah.
And so I always tell them, I go, if you didn't do your exercises, I don't care.
Yeah.
I really don't care. We're going to get through this. It's going to take time. The goal, it's a long recovery process. If you have bad posture, if you didn't take your notes, if you didn't do your self-awareness exercises this week, who cares? There's no guilt here. It's about, if you didn't do it, it's because you obviously had a level of exhaustion where the priority was recovery, not activity.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that just too many people aren't willing to be compassionate with themselves. We're in a world
Yeah.
where harshness is a common reality. And so they think they have to be
Crack
harsh
the
with
whip.
themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
more I
Crack the
crack the
whip.
whip, the stronger I'll be, the faster I'll go. Yeah, it's about this sense of worthiness, right? So if somebody could come in and say, I'm worthy to be here. I'm worthy to be on this journey. I want to treat myself kindly. I want to take care of myself. In reality, that didn't really come to fruition this week in terms of doing my exercises and my stretches and blah 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 blah. But just because it didn't necessarily fit into my life in that practical way, I still feel worthy. And then you have the opposite, where people are like, I did my exercises, and they're like stressed about recovering properly,
Yeah, that there's
and
stress.
they've completely missed the mark of just like sitting with the worthiness and the
Exactly.
self-compassion, right?
Pete Holmes, who's a comedian, has this great bit where he says, you think your problems matter? It's like, you think you're in Gatineau right now? Zoom out.
Yeah.
You're on a rock
Yeah.
floating in infinite nothingness that's expanding. That doesn't make
Exactly.
sense. And
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, seriously, if you think this week you miss your exercises and your self-care and that it's going to play into the lifespan of your existence, zoom out and go, oh, out of the 52 weeks in the year and the 60 plus years of my life, is 1 week going to be what ruins my experience on earth?
Yeah.
Like, no, it's not that 1 week of self-care where you're going to go, I failed horribly as a human.
Yeah.
And it's about reducing that level of guilt. And that's where what you do to me seems so important. I mean, you talk about compassion fatigue so much for first line workers and frontline workers, and people have such a hard time being compassionate with themselves. And that's really what I want to spend the rest of this podcast about, is you really expressing how it is that you think people can, the tools that people can use, but also just experiences that people can be aware, like, why am I not giving compassion to myself? Because like during my burnout, that was definitely one of the biggest consequences. And without my wife helping me through it, it would have been a much different experience. But the fact that she gave me space to say, it's okay. You're allowed being weak. You're allowed feeling weak. You're allowed taking time. You're allowed not doing your exercises today. You're allowed crying today. All these things like that. That sensation of feeling safe and vulnerable, to have love for yourself and compassion for yourself, really made it where, okay, I took maybe 9 to 10 months to get out of my burnout, which to me is incredibly quick compared to what I see a lot of my clients going through, who are at, year 3, year 4, some of them.
Yeah.
And so that idea of compassion to me really interests me.
Yeah. I think if you're going to talk about burnout, you have to talk about that piece, again, both in the self-compassion being, a bit of the antidote to it, or a way of building up that immunity, that resiliency. The more we have self-compassion, it's kind of like boosting your immunity, so that when stressors come in, you're sort of, you've got that buffer, that ability to get through it. So I think that self-compassion, again, from all angles, or prevention, getting through difficult times, and as well as recovery, is super important. And that piece around compassion fatigue, it's really tricky. I mean, this is what compassion fatigue really is, and the terminology is kind of shifting, that we call it empathy-based stress. So then when we're talking about all of the stress that's in our life, doing things, trying to keep up with the laundry, trying to keep the business afloat, and all this sort of stuff, there's all of those things. Then there's empathy-based stress, which is the stress that we experience by connecting heart to heart with other people who are in struggle. So when people are on the bed and you're like just trying to, maybe you're sitting there going, okay, like, did I pay the bills this month? All that sort of stuff. And then, like you were saying before, like then somebody's confiding in you and talking to you about their personal problems because they feel safe in that space. And now it's starting to flow. The vulnerability is because you've created this safe space. And as you're moving the energy through the body and you're asking them curious questions about their well-being and about their life, right? Then all of a sudden there's this openness. So people start talking about their personal problems. And if you're an empathetic person, if you approach that wholeheartedly, you're not just like, yeah, I'm writing down a note or something like that, but you're really like, wow, you're going through a lot. I empathize with that. I'm moved by that. That's empathy-based stress. So that is that's an even more subtle chronic stress experience that's at play. So that can, the way I always describe it is kind of like you start off wholehearted and then you connect with people. Your empathy connects you to suffering, and then you feel the brokenhearted because how people are struggling, and then you don't know what to do about that. So what compassion fatigue is basically your heart going, I'm getting hurt out there every time I listen to people.
I love the way you just described that, because it's, as massage therapists, we're not psychologists, and we're not supposed to be psychologists. And yet, we talk about, it's a joke in the industry, but we talk about it all the time. Someone is majority of the time naked under some sheets, letting you touch them, aside from your spouse or your doctor who does that. And so there's this level of trust that is usually associated with your spouse or your doctor. And so they confide in you and stuff that you're like, I wasn't ready for that story. I'm not trained for that story, but I have confidentiality laws around it. I'm not allowed interacting in a certain way because I'm not a psychologist. I just have to hold the space.
Yeah.
But it means as a therapist, you have to sit there and go, I don't know what to do with this. That's wonderful. I love that.
Yeah. And I remember saying earlier in my career, like, I wish I could unhear what I've heard sometimes, you know what I mean? Like, because sometimes you're in those spaces and you're like, I didn't consent to this. Like, this is coming at me.
Yeah.
And once you know it, you can't unknow it. And if you approach it, not just with knowing it, but like you're approaching it honestly with your heart, it creates heartache. And your heart, everything in you is designed to survive, right? like we're just, that's the way we're programmed. And so again, from that psychological point of view, like your nervous system, your psyche, your spirit goes, oh my God, this feels dangerous. This feels like a lot. I need to protect myself. So what do? You put walls up around your heart. You numb your empathetic concern. You numb your self-awareness, you numb your feelings in order to get through that moment. So it's not so painful as you're absorbing this information. The problem is that then that becomes pattern and it trickles into other areas of your life. So now this business that you created, that you were incredibly passionate about, that you were so enthusiastic about, spending the rest of your life doing, you're like, I feel nothing. I'm numb to it.
You have no joy around the experience anymore.
You have no joy around the experience. You go home to your partner and you're like, woo, everybody's like so excited that you're finally home. And you're like, I feel nothing. Right?
Yeah.
Because I check my heart at the door, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. I have to leave because it's hard to switch the emotions on and off. So if you have those walls around that empathy, you don't bring it home and go, I'm going to take these walls down, because then everything comes out. Exactly. And then you can't turn it on and off. And it's interesting because when we talk about allostatic load, I talk about allostatic load and I tell people, you got to remember going to the bathroom is part of allostatic load. Breathing, gravity is part of it. Like, we forget gravity is a stress on our bodies. Yes, it's unconscious, it's in the background, but it's present. Temperature, vibrate, all these things. And we forget about that. But I historically have not talked about what you just described, which is true. empathetic stress, like that totally fills up the jar, especially in this industry. It fills the jar up a significant chunk, especially if you are overloading your caseload. The other day, I had a series of circumstances where made it where I had to work an 8-hour day in massage instead of a 4-hour day, which is not encouraged that much. It's a lot to see 8 clients in a day, especially if they are all going to have stories. And of course, on the day I do it, they all happen to have heavy stories. And so it means you go home and you're like, man, I'm sleeping on my own tonight. I'm checking out mentally. And it's interesting because I'm going to have to add that to my classes when I talk about the effect of allostatic load, because that empathetic background stress is so vital to us.
Yeah. So as a therapist, obviously I signed up for sitting with people and listening and being with them. But I definitely never learned about, what to do with that, the kind of the emotional residue that's left behind, even when they, walk out the door, like what stays with me. So that is very much what I do nowadays, and talk a lot about, with individuals and what I teach my workshops. So
I'm sorry, you're filled with nuggets of good information. Emotional residue. My God, I love that term. I'm gonna have to go through this podcast and just write down all the terms that you've used, because I love them.
I'm super visual, and so whether I picture the problem or I'm picturing a solution I'm trying to apply, I have to put a visual to it. So I often think about like a veil, of like imagine that 8-hour shift, and every every client that you see that day, like there's this residue or this veil that they leave. And then, if you add like, 8 veils over your eyes, and then again, just like what you're saying, literally the gravity of that, the pressure, the weight of that, right, is that, so you don't, so it starts to accumulate. So it's that cleansing experience, that transition at the end of the day, that is so important. And so I imagine the emotional residue, and I literally go to the bathroom and I put the warm water on, and I have my scented soaps and my everything in my bathroom that, I've kind of tailored just to my liking, right? And I have this practice where at the end of my day, I pretty much wash my hands right up to my elbows, and I just breathe deeply. And as I'm looking at the water go down the drain, I'm imagining that emotional residue going with it. And it's just this grounding practice at the end of the day, and which is super ironic now, because I don't actually transition very much from like work to home, because I work in my home. And so I had to build in, because it used to kind of be part of my drive home, I'd sort of blare the music. I'd like always said, like, as long as I could feel the vibration of the beat in my chest, it was like, there was this like, it was like vibrating and cleansing in that experience, right? I always
scream a little plum crazy into the speakers.
Oh, yeah. That's right. You laugh, but like we still have Plum Crazy on cassette. So these practices to move that energy through to cleanse, I think that's super important. One of the preventative practices that I bring into my work is I have this little mantra that I say pretty much every day before I start my job, or like before I start seeing clients. And it goes, be the strainer, not the sponge. And I like that. Be the strainer, not the sponge. In other words, if you know that you are going to be in the presence of suffering, then you need to make sure that you're going into that understanding what is going to happen and how you want to approach it. And I want to, so there's be the strainer, not the sponge. And because I'm definitely the sponge. If I'm not careful, I'm the sponge. I'm this absorbent, right? Like I just take it all in.
I think most first frontline and most healers would probably be the sponge.
Yeah, exactly. The swing though is like what we were talking about before. After you've been the sponge and you get oversaturated for long enough, the swing over to the other side is the rock. You harden, right? And it's like nothing's coming out, nothing's going in, right? And that really, like, I've been there plenty of times too, and usually people kind of go like, what the hell's going on with you, right? Because you're so out of your character when you're in that space, right? It's this overprotective, over rigid kind of kind of place. And that's where then like when just like the little things don't go the way they're planned, you're so rigid and so hardened to it that you're like, you have no tolerance for, there's no psychological
Yeah,
flexibility
there's
in
no
that
compassion.
space, right? Yeah. So I don't want to be the rock, but I also don't want to be the sponge. The middle place is this idea of being the strainer. And again, I'm a visual person, so that just helps me I just visualize this idea that I may be in the presence of suffering. I want to stay present with it. I want to hold space for it. But it's going to pass through me. And I'm not going to hold on to any of it. It's not my story. It's not my pain. Holding on to it doesn't help anybody. Holding on to it and absorbing it so that then like when I get home and my partner says like, what do you want for supper? And then I like wring out the sponge on him and be like, and like emotionally dump
I
all of the
want you to
things I
make dinner
accumulated
and I
throughout the
want
day.
nothing, no decision process.
We've all been there, right? Where
Exactly.
you kind of absorb everything, stresses of the day, and then you sort of dump it on somebody. So that's a really helpful one for me.
I used to do one.
Yeah.
I used to do one called "Mine or Yours,"
Yeah.
and I used to imagine if you're at like a convention and everybody and you don't know people, everybody has name tags. And so you sit around sit around a table, and everybody with their eyes closed takes off their name tag and they put it in the center of the table. Somebody mixes them up, and then with your eyes closed, you pick up a random name tag and then you put it on. And when everybody has one, you open your eyes. If it's your name tag, you keep it. If it's not, you just put it back in the center of the circle.
Mm-hmm.
And people are like, yeah, that sounds super easy. It's like, yeah, now just replace it with emotions. If it's yours, you get to keep it. If it's not yours, you put it back down. And after my clients, especially my big sessions, I'll tend to sit there and I'll go, okay, I just take like 2 minutes with the door closed to sit there and go, mine, yours, mine, which ones are mine, which ones are yours, so that I remember at the end of the day, this is not mine. I don't need to hang on to it. This one is mine and I should hang on to it.
And that's the mindfulness practice, right?
Because then you do have to know
do
what's
that
yours,
intentionally.
though.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to be self-aware enough to know what is yours, and you have to take a minute. Just take a minute and go through the process. The way the other visual that I apply to it is like imagining that we're oil and water, and that when you're together, and there are times at the end of the day where it's like it all gets stirred up, and so you can't differentiate what's what. It's just all in the glass together. But if at the end of the day you put the glass down and you just let it settle, just quiet your mind, quiet the world, and just sit for a second, that oil and water will separate again. And then you do mine, yours, right?
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
So I love that we're vibing in the same way, right? Of just, but it's so it's that, and I call that differentiation, the skill of being able to differentiate what is my story and what is theirs, and what is mine and what is theirs. And we differentiate in order to avoid disconnecting, because if we don't differentiate consciously, intentionally, then we will unconsciously disconnect, right? Where it's much more rigid and it's much more like, I can't go there. Or we disconnect from ourselves.
Do you find that, switching subjects here to the cynicism aspect of it a little bit, where when we differentiate like mine, yours, the rock, the sponge, things like that, I can see the rock, equating cynicism essentially, kind of thing like that. Mm-hmm. But then I've also found that like sometimes I'll be with other therapists and where that cynicism tends to come out, but it's more of it's interesting. It seems to be more in a joking, jovial, connecting manner. Mm-hmm. And part of me always wonders, is that a true bitterness? Or is that, no, this is a connection that we're seeking with like-minded individuals, versus, no, I'm embittered toward this experience. Because I can see that cynicism being a really fine balance for a lot of people. And a lot of the listeners I happen to know are cynical by nature, or who have been in the industry for a very long time. And cynicism will be something that we've all experienced in the industry. And so it's one of those fine things of, okay, if I am cynical, do I need to pay attention and instantly recover to find my empathy again? Or is this, no, okay, I'm just taking a moment to be me?
Yeah. I think that I do think that foundationally, what is super important for us to carry forward, whether we're like making jokes about what's going on or talking about the realities and the difficult parts and stuff like that, I think that we need to carry forward this, kind of client-centered, sort of compassionate point of view, hope, because when I think about cynicism, and that jadedness, I think that it's when we start feeling like kind of like the what's the point part. And I think that is us potentially losing sight of our mission and our purpose. And so a lot of the work I do in my workshops and with individuals is that work, well, we need to remind ourselves of why you do what you do. In fact, that's usually also is one of those signals of burnout, or compassion fatigue, is like when you wake up in the morning going why the hell am I doing this?
Yeah.
What is the point of
Why
this?
am I in this job and not another
Why
job?
do I don't even want to anymore. So I think again, there's those layers of it and the nuances. I don't think that we need to be chipper and positive about the work we do all the time. And I think we can bring in humor, and I think we can bring in the stories, and I think we can have some good vent sessions, but underneath that is still this hope or this understanding of why we do what we do, and that it's all still worth it, and that we feel like that we still get satisfaction for what we do. So I think, I don't know how to, I guess it's sort of doing that self-awareness work of sort of stepping back and saying, am I doing this in a way that still is balanced out by hopeful conversations and kind of yeah, well, that was fun just to rip off a few jokes, but now let's take a breath and roll our shoulders back and go let's do this, let's go help
Come to
people,
the intent and the purpose. Yeah.
yeah, come back to it. And so just like you said, spanning out, always think about your guiding light, or your North Star is your mission, your purpose. And we have to span out from the day-to-day BS and
Yeah.
difficulties and remember that guiding light, the purpose.
And purpose is such an interesting thing, because when I was going through my burnout, that's easily the thing that I felt I'd lost the most was purpose. I knew that what I was doing helped people with their pain so they had a better quality of life. But I remember also thinking, anybody else can do this. There's no reason it has to be me. And there was a big loss of sense of purpose. And I think when I started feeling motivated again, purpose was easily the thing that I felt coming back, there is a reason for this. And I think that really helped bring in a desire to be mindful and a desire to have a connected experience with the clientele again. So that was the purpose was so valuable to coming away from essentially that cynicism.
And I think that the thing I want to add to that, because when I went through my burnout, and I very much was the same thing, it was what the hell is the point of all of this? Where's the purpose in all this? It was because I was so focused on seeing these positive outcomes that I didn't see, because the nature of my work often meant that I kind of swooped in, helped in the way. I never really got to see the end of the line, the stories. So I was so focused on those positive outcomes being the reason why this was all worth it. And when I wasn't seeing that, I lost hope. So a part of reconnecting with my purpose was making sure that the way I describe it is it's this faithfulness. It's this, if there's any, not in a religious sense, but this faith, which is believing in something even when you can't see it, And so that is something that I think I do a lot with now as well, of maintaining that mission and that purpose, is just believing in the impact even when I don't get to see it all.
Yeah. It's interesting because lately I would say most of my career, actually, I think one of the things that most of the clients who I've seen have enjoyed in their experiences is that they can come into a session feeling, and it's happened recently, coming in feeling demoralized by their recovery process. They'll have gone 3 weeks pain-free, and then on week 3 their pain comes back and they're like, I didn't do anything, why is my pain back? And they're not understanding necessarily the neuroplastic aspect of habituation around chronic pain. And we talk about all that. And I've noticed, though, that most of the clients who are demoralized, by the end of the session, they walk away hopeful. And I think that's one of the things that more we look at patient-centered care and the biopsychosocial approach into medicine, the more we're seeing that walking away with a sense of hope and purpose for a client is almost as valuable as literally having them experience pain-free behavior. Like the pain-free behavior is obviously very, I got a result and that's great. But having this hope that long-term there is this recovery process taking place, long-term there is this goal where I will be pain-free or close to pain-free. That sense of purpose is so important for them in the session as a client, but also for a therapist to sit there and go, I'm content to work with this client for the next 6 months, studiously to make sure that they're pain-free and I see the results happening. Because I think a lot of people get burnt out on that too. They go, what I'm doing doesn't seem to be effective. In which case, yes, you may have to change techniques. But I also think there's a component where people just get that lack of sense of value in their work.
Well, as you're saying all that too, though, I think something that we have in common is that sometimes despite your commitment, your hope, your efforts, your skills, that the outcomes don't happen because there are a lot of personal barriers that patient is experiencing. That I say these words very cautiously in the sense that there's a lot of associations with this term, but self-sabotage. And I say that the reason why I say it cautiously is because I don't think anybody in this world goes, aha, I'm going to self-sabotage so I can live in pain, emotionally, psychologically,
physically. Humans whatever. I know who might do that.
Maybe there's a few out there. We used to call those the purples in my work. We used to like color code client experiences, and so you said I can swear on this. So there were the fuckets, like the we call them the purples, and they were the ones that just like I don't matter, you don't matter, nothing matters, fuck the world.
Lost hope aspect.
And undoubtedly there are some people who have gone through some very difficult lives, and that's the outcome is that perspective. But no, I think that for most of us, though, we are not intentionally self-sabotaging, but as you said, we're in patterns, and there are habits that are not serving us well, that life as it is, the ecosystem is sick, the environments that we are in are not healthy and balanced. And we are in, when we talk about, as a social worker, I'm constantly looking at what we call the biopsychosocial structural lens of every client. And so we're looking at the structural factors: economic status, race, gender, family status, social status, all that. We're looking at, psychological experiences, childhood experiences, trauma, history, all of that sort of stuff. And when we're looking at the body and biology, like predispositions and conditions and health factors and all that. And it's all at play. And that's just within an individual. Then you take all these individuals and you create this massive ecosystem that is all at play, and frankly, not always super healthy out there, right?
Not harmoniously.
It's not a smooth world that we're living in. So, why do people stay in pain? Lots and lots of reasons. And I think that as, in my career, I have had to also be humble about that and not take ownership or responsibility for the lack of progress despite my efforts, and going in with not owning that, like it's not my responsibility to save people.
The lack of progress is such a great one too, because in manual therapy we get it all the time. You treat somebody for a condition, let's say low back pain. So 10 of your clients get better, one of them doesn't, and you're like, what did I do differently? And they're not realizing necessarily that one of the largest and most impactful aspects of recovery has nothing to do with what we do with our hands, and has everything to do with context. And context plays into rapport. It plays into trust, vulnerability. It plays into places and stages in their life. Like I have several clients right now who are going through, in Quebec, it's called cynicism, which is, employment insurance because of their injuries. Now they're all better. They feel better, but they still have to go through these processes, and they go to these appointments, and it takes time out of their life, and the appointments are no longer valuable, but they have to do it for the insurance purposes. And so they go to these appointments and they walk in with an attitude of, I don't really care. And it makes sense because they feel safe, they feel healthy. It's no longer valuable for them. And yet they're being forced to take part in these treatments. And a lot of the times therapists, like if you belong to an insurance network, those are the therapists you get. Whether you get results with them or not doesn't apply. It's this is who you get, because the context of report, like if I have a female client who comes and sees me and they start talking to me about sexual abuse, one of the first conversations I'll have with them is, do you want me to refer you out? Because do you feel vulnerable with me as a male therapist? And some are fine with it, some aren't. And it's one of those contexts where if you don't take the rapport into account, the healing process gets very limited because it goes so beyond structure and function. It goes into so many more. And a lot of therapists forget that, like you said, being humble is being willing to admit, I'm not the solution for everyone. I'm only the solution for the people who get better with me. I'm not the solution for every human who comes through the door. That would be arrogance. And so it's a hard thing to learn to say that, especially when, like we talked about earlier, you're self-employed and you're thinking, oh, my rent is due and I need this extra client to pay my rent. Yeah.
I see that a lot in psychotherapy practices too. People just working with everybody instead of considering the context and the match and the connection, and that's all there. And people, like, I don't know if you ever think about it this way, but that they're actually being 4 people in the room with you when you're there together with a patient. That
Are you talking about 90-10?
I don't know. I'm talking
the
about
person
the
in the
fact
present
that,
and the person in the past.
Yeah,
and then you
basically.
in the present and you in the past.
Kind of, yeah, exactly. It's exactly it.
Your baggage,
right?
kind of thing.
I call it our ghosts.
Yeah.
That and so even with that individual in front of me, like what's there, but that I can't work with, is their ghost, their past, and they may not even be aware of their ghost. So it's not even like they can consciously bring that in and say, this is what I need from you, or maybe this should be considered as we work together, my history, my past, my feelings, because they may be numb to that and haven't done that work. So, and a lot of us haven't done the work. I mean, I'm like always doing the work. Like it's a lifetime experience, right?
That's why I'm doing these podcasts. This is my version of work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like talking about it, getting curious about it. And that's why I always say I'm grateful for my burnout, because it snapped me out of oblivion. And it was just this moment where I was like, I gotta look at this stuff, who I am, what makes me tick, my ghosts, what I bring to my relationships, to my job, to my adult life,
I love that you say you're
learning.
grateful for your burnout, because I mean, I'm in the same boat. I think it was one of the better things that happened to me, even though it was painful in the experience.
So painful.
And it's something I tell clients all the time is like, I know you're in pain right now and you don't like to think of it this way, but pain is always a positive experience. Pain is always protective in nature. It's always defensive in nature. It's always attempting to save something. It's designed as a reaction to something to make us protect our own existence.
Yeah.
And people who experience chronic pain don't like thinking of that, because they go, oh, well, that means this pain that I'm experiencing, I need to be thankful for it. I need to be happy that it's happening, which is obviously difficult to, it's a hard conversation to breach, especially in the beginning. But it's like you said, being grateful for the valleys in life helps bring us to the peaks. And that's a great way of,
So and not all of us can say we're thankful for our pain. That's a pretty, funky, statement to make. But to almost sort of go like, but pain does have a purpose, and you might see it. Like Thich Nhat Hanh says in his books, and this is, sort of Buddhist approach to suffering, is, this idea of like the plant that dies and becomes refuse, that if you are the gardener who understands how to take that dead thing and turn it into compost, right? Or like to take the shit that we see in life and go, okay, well, that's shit now, but I can turn that shit into
fertilizer
and grow something new from it. Yeah. So again, it comes back to those core beliefs about what is resiliency. And it's not just about opportunity, privilege, like, oh, well, it's good for you that you can, get through stress because maybe your stress is different than mine. And that is another one too that I always say, yep, we are not all on the same boat. Like that whole idea that like stress is stress. No, it's not.
My last guest was a Black man who lives in Texas. And during the Black Lives Matter, him and I talk about it in my last interview about how he gets pulled over with he's married to a white woman. So they're an interracially married couple in this small town in Texas. And I'm like, yeah, we don't have the same stresses. I can't imagine being in that scenario. I can't even put myself in that position.
Yeah. No, all suffering is not the same, but all suffering is worthy of compassion.
Yeah.
And so again, including our own, the big, the small, yeah. So what's our takeaways, Troy? Like self-awareness.
Self-awareness is key. Pay attention to your exhaustion. Exhaustion is really important. Once we've hit cynicism, that's a big sign. And those are signs that other humans around us can pay attention to let us know, oh, we need to start turning around or shifting attitude or behavior. And that when we've gone burnout, really, you've gone to burn numb, which you're at numb out, which I think is great. I really love that. And then what was the people pleaser? What was that one?
Overachiever people pleaser.
Overachiever people pleaser. I think that one is going to be the title of the podcast, because I think that one is like, I can think of the many massage therapists I've taught, the thousands of people I've encountered who are massage therapists and manual therapists, and go, oh, that's you fit that description quite well. Yeah. And whether they've been in the industry short or long. And so I love that one. So thank you. If people are interested in learning more about your stuff, feel free. This is your moment to tell them where they can hear more of your stuff.
I do try to add a lot of free resources and helping people with their experiences with burnout and compassion fatigue on my website, which is my name, amandarocheleau.com. I have a free resource page there that you are welcome to visit at any time. I'm constantly updating it, throwing new stuff out there. Right now, I've got a self-compassion video up for free. So if you want to sort of dabble in self-compassion and sort of see what it feels like to have a self-compassionate moment, there's a video, a guided kind of meditation there for you. And yeah, I'm a public speaker and I do workshops, and I have some associates. We're all providing therapy, trying to get the capacity to be able to serve Quebec patients as well. Right now we are dealing with colleges and weird restrictions and jurisdictions and all that sort of stuff. But so if anybody is out there, just wanting to get curious about your experience, if some of the things that were said today were like a little illuminating to you and you thought, maybe that's me, maybe I'm on stage 3, or maybe I'm feeling something, there's some assessment tools there. I always call them like the cheat sheets, like the when you're like, I'm not sure what I'm experiencing, well, there's some tools there you can answer some questions, and it's going to give you some information about maybe kind of where you're at on that like stress continuum or the mental health continuum. So I invite you all to visit my website, amandarocheleau.com. The Giving Tree podcast is out there too. You can listen to it. I had to do our interview in a 2-parter because we just talked for nonstop. We was late at night and we were rambling, and and I edited a lot out too. So, I
listen to your podcast all the time. I encourage a lot of my clients. I share your podcast with most of my clients, actually, especially who are in the healthcare industry.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks. Yeah.
Awesome.
So that's me. Thanks so much for having me, Troy.
Thanks so much, Amanda, for helping talk about some of the psychological aspects to some of the stuff we talk about with burnout. And I appreciate it. And it's great to see you again.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.